Here is something that ought to be impossible. Over about 400 years, 6 different dynasties, different rulers, different times, different reasons, all picked the exact same city to be their capital. Same patch of ground on the lower Yangtze, over and over again. Now, when one king picks a spot, that is a preference. When 6 unrelated dynasties pick the same spot across centuries, that is not preference. That is something harder. That is the ground itself telling them where to go. The city is the one we now call Nanjing, and the question I want to chew on isn't, why was it nice? Lots of places are nice. The question is, why was it the only answer? Why, when you actually run the numbers on the whole of southern China, does every road lead to that one bend in the river? Because it does. I went and looked. And the answer has nothing to do with luck and nothing to do with magic. It is the coldest piece of arithmetic in Chinese geography. A process of elimination so brutal that by the end, the emperors barely got a vote. Let me walk you through how you eliminate half a continent and end up with one city. First, you have to understand the board you are playing on. Southern China back then wasn't the lush sprawl you might picture. Most of it was hills, swamp, and wilderness. Nobody could farm. The usable land, the land that could feed cities and float boats and grow tax revenue, ran in a thin ribbon along the rivers, and above all along one river, the Yangtze. The whole of the South was organized around that single artery, the way a ranch is organized around its one reliable creek. Everything that mattered, the farmland, the trade, the cities, clung to the water. Get away from the Yangtze and its feeder rivers, and you were in country that couldn't support a capital any more than a desert could. So the search starts there. Somewhere on this great river, or its system, there has to be a place big enough and rich enough to seat the government of half of China. And when you actually survey the whole length of it, there turn out to be only 3 candidates. 3 economic basins on the entire Yangtze with the size and the wealth to even be in the running. The basin of the southeast, call it the Jiangdong, the lower river. The basin of the middle, around the Han River. And the basin of the far west, Sichuan, the Chuan Yu country. 3 contenders for the throne of the south. Watch how fast 2 of them fall. Sichuan goes out first, and it goes out because of one thing, the 3 gorges. On paper, Sichuan is a beautiful candidate. Rich farmland walled off behind mountains. Easy to defend. A giant natural fortress. But here is the killer, and it is pure logistics. The kind a man who has moved freight understands in his gut. To get from Sichuan down to the rest of the Yangtze, your boats have to run the 3 gorges. And the gorges, before the modern dam tamed them, were a nightmare. The river squeezes between sheer 1,000-foot cliffs until it is 100 meters wide. In spots, just a few dozen. All the water of western China forced through a slot that narrow, running at a speed that could smash a boat to splinters. Hidden rocks, killer rapids that vanished under the high summer water and reappeared in winter. A channel so tight and so deadly that boats had to go through one at a time, in single file, each waiting until the one ahead was well clear. Think about what that means for moving an army, or grain, or anything at scale. You can't. Everything has to thread through that needle one boat at a time. And going the other way north, overland, runs you straight into the most ruinously expensive supply road in all of China. The mountain passes that, the saying goes. Worked a prime minister to death just trying to keep an army fed across them. A rancher's first law. It doesn't matter how good your grass is if you can't get the cattle to market. Sichuan had the grass. It couldn't get to market. A government box behind the gorges could be in open revolt for half a year before its army even cleared the canyon. You cannot run a country from inside a bottleneck. Sichuan's out. 2 left. The middle basin, around the Han River versus the southeast, the Jiangdong. And on first look, the middle ought to win. It sits right in the center, the perfect hinge between the upper river and the lower. If you just wanted to control the Yangtze, the middle is where you'd stand. But controlling a river and feeding a capital are 2 different jobs. And on the second job, the Middle Basin comes up short 3 different ways. First, land. For most of this era, a huge chunk of the best ground in the Middle Basin wasn't farmland at all. It was a vast lake and marsh country, the old Yunmeng wetland, that wouldn't fully dry into usable land for centuries yet. So the farmable acreage was thinner than it looks on a map. Second, and this is the one people miss, water networks. Not just having a river, but having a dense web of little channels feeding into it. Because here is why the old Chinese said water is wealth. A thick network of waterways means cheap transport, which means 1,000 little workshops and farms can all float their goods to market and trade with each other. Dense water knits a region into one connected economy. The Middle Basin had a river. It didn't have the web. The Southeast did. And third, the killer, salt and copper. The Southeast, the Jiangdong, sat on the sea, which meant salt, and it sat on copper, which meant it could mint coin. Salt and coin were the 2 economic engines of the ancient Chinese state. The same 2 levers an emperor centuries earlier used to fund the wars that broke the steppe. The Middle Basin had neither. No sea salt, no copper, thinner land, looser water, and none of the resources that print money, a fine place to guard the river from. Not a place that can pay for an empire. The Middle Basin's out, which leaves one, the Southeast, the Jiangdong, the lower Yangtze. And the thing you have to understand about the Jiangdong is that it wasn't a new frontier that got lucky. It was old money, ancient money. While most of southern China was still wilderness, barely touched, the Jiangdong was already rich enough, already organized enough, that it fielded major powers back in the age of the old warring states, centuries before the South as a whole counted for anything. Why? Because heaven dealt it the best hand on the whole river, and dealt it early. The richest farmland, the densest network of waterways anywhere in China, that web of cheap transport that turns scattered farms into a single humming economy. The sea for salt, the copper for coin. Every single thing the other 2 basins were missing, the Jiangdong had, and had in abundance, and had had for 1,000 years. War is just a contest of resources with the politeness stripped off, and the smooth running of a government, feeding the officials, paying the soldiers, greasing the whole machine. That runs on resources even more than war does. You can't seat the government of half a continent anywhere that has to be fed by somewhere else. It has to sit on top of its own wealth. There was only one basin in the entire South that could feed itself, and a capital. So the question was never really which basin. The map answered that before any emperor was born. The only question left was, where inside the Jiangdong do you put the city? And here is where it gets precise. Because even inside the rich Southeast, Nanjing's exact spot wasn't an accident either. 2 things pin it there. First, it is the collection point. The wealth of the Jiangdong didn't sit in one pile. It was spread across the rich lands around it, the old Wu country, and the rivers and canals of that region all feed toward Nanjing's position, the way creeks run downhill into one river. Sit there, and the resources of the whole basin come to you, floating downstream, cheap and steady. You are not chasing the wealth. The geography delivers it to your door. Second, it is the hinge to the north. Nanjing sits at a kind of golden ratio point on the way up to the Huai River, the great natural line between North and South China, close enough to the frontier to project power toward it and defend against what comes down from the north. But, crucially, not sitting right on the frontier itself. And that is a rule a soldier learns the hard way. You don't pitch your headquarters on the firing line. A capital sitting right on the contested border is a capital that gets sacked the first time the line moves. You want to be set back, near enough to reach the fight fast, far enough back that losing one battle doesn't lose you the government. Nanjing threads that needle. Forward enough to matter, back enough to survive. Collection point for the money. Safe hinge to the frontier. Inside the only basin that could pay the bills, run all 3 filters, and there is exactly 1 dot left on the map. Now, the old Chinese had another whole language for all this, and it is the part foreigners laugh at. They called it feng shui, wind and water. And I'll grant you, a lot of what got said in its name was pure superstition. But strip the mystic paint off it, and underneath there is a layer that is just hard-won observation about land and water. Dressed up in old words, take their single biggest rule about rivers. They said a river that runs straight past you, fast and hard, is bad. They call that kind of force a shui, a cutting energy. A river that curves, that bends and slows as it passes you. That is the good kind. The best of all they call the jade belt. The water looping gently around you like a belt around a waist sounds like mysticism. It isn't. Think about it as a man who has worked moving water and goods. A river screaming past you in a straight, fast line. You can't easily land a boat on it. Can't easily pull wealth off it. And it'll chew your bank to pieces in a flood. All that commerce just blasts past your door and you can't grab any of it. But a river that bends and slows right at your spot, that is where boats can put in. That is where goods can be loaded and landed. That is where the wealth pools up instead of rushing by. To the west of Nanjing, the Yangtze runs off in a hard straight line, wealth blasting past, ungraspable. But right at Nanjing, the great river bends. It turns. It slows. The jade belt. And under all the mystic language, what the old geomancers were really saying is the same thing. A freight man would say plain. You don't build your warehouse on the rapids. You build it on the calm bend where the boats can actually stop. They just said it in the language of dragons. So step back. I'll tell you what I saw. I saw 6 dynasties, strangers to each other across 400 years, all choose the same city. And I saw that almost none of it was a choice at all. The ground chose for them. Run the filters, one after another. And they fall like dominoes. The whole South organized on one river. Only 3 basins big enough to matter. Sichuan locked behind a canyon that strangles its own freight. The middle basin too thin, too dry of the deep water web, and missing the salt and copper that print money. Only the Jiangdong left standing. Old money, the best hand on the river, and inside it only one dot that collects the wealth and guards the frontier without sitting on it. 6 dynasties didn't pick Nanjing. Nanjing was the answer to a math problem, and they were just the ones who happened to be holding the pencil. And here is the part I keep turning over. Even the magic, the feng shui, the dragons and belts and cutting energies, even that, when you scrape the paint off, turns out to be plain old practical sense about land and water, remembered so long it hardened into ritual. The bend where boats can stop, the high ground at your back, the open field in front. Our ancestors everywhere learned the same hard truths about where it is safe to build. They just wrote them down in different languages. That is the lesson I rode away with. The land was deciding things long before the emperors thought they were. The smart ones didn't fight the map. They read it and put their city exactly where the river had already said to. Ride with me.